Paul Warburg, it's great to finally meet you after having watched so many of your videos for a long time. So here we are on the fourth anniversary. Is it simply the fourth anniversary? Is it just another year of war, or does this have any significance for you or for Ukraine or for Russia?
I think the most significant fact about year number 4 is that the war has now gone on longer for Russia than what they call the Great Patriotic War, basically the war against Germany in World War II lasted. So in terms of length and time, that's a relatively significant milestone. But of course, it's a different kind of war. It's significant because if you look at historical wars of this type, I know a lot of people feel like the war is going to end soon or should end soon. But really, when you look at historical wars of this type, this is kind of approaching the low end of the average halfway point in the war. So it's a significant milestone. You know, a lot of things have happened, and I'm sure we'll talk about those as we go on. But the year number isn't as significant in and of itself as what's happening now that the war has lasted 4 years.
And of course, Russia is larger than Ukraine. It potentially has a larger manpower pool, although it's gone through a lot of that. But you know, how long can Ukraine hold on, and could Ukraine ever win this war?
Yeah, it's a great question. As far as the specifics of how long Ukraine can hold on, it's hard to say, but I always like to answer they can hold on as long as Russia can, and that's the most important piece. You know, Russia's a larger country, and I think a lot of people overweight that, but they don't weight what we actually see on the battlefield and the technological changes that are driving the war. You know, Ukraine put a much higher casualty rate on the Russian troops than the Russian troops do on them. So by sheer size alone, those things sort of balance out. But what's even more significant is Ukraine focuses more and more on drone advances, and now even ground robotics. Things like this are coming forward. And this is causing Ukraine to lose even less men. And if we look at the last year of the war, it's quite impressive how few men Ukraine has lost, and all of these technologies that Ukraine is using to really put high rates of attrition on the Russian military, they're homegrown by Ukraine when it comes to drones and things like that. And there's a milestone that was recently reached where Russian soldiers are now becoming casualties, actually dying at a faster rate than Russia can recruit them. And so if that trend continues, which so far it has for a couple of months, that is a tipping point in the war, because it means that from this point forward, the Russian military will shrink. It might shrink slowly over time, but Ukraine has proven that they can hold out for quite a while. And when we look at, other aspects of Ukrainian defenses, Russia currently, they are pushing on some fortified Ukrainian positions, but these are positions that were fortified in somewhat in haste, because obviously the Russians were attacking and they couldn't be as hardened as you otherwise could. And yet Ukraine is holding very well. But since the war has been ongoing, Ukraine has actually built some new fortified positions, which are much stronger even behind those ones. And so when we look at all the factors of the war, Ukraine does have the capability to continue fighting for quite a while longer, especially when it's Russia who is doing the attacking and not Ukraine. And Ukraine can outlast them that way.
And you have talked a lot about the damage this war is doing to Russia internally, culturally, politically, economically, of course. How has, I mean, what's the damage assessment?
Well, the economy is in shambles, obviously. I could go on a whole long diatribe on that, but long story short, the ruble is fading, and we can tell that because Russia is having to do the number one thing they don't want to do, which is lower recruitment bonuses for their soldiers, which essentially is, kind of proof that they're running out of money. They've chosen this strategy to recruit soldiers rather than conscription for a reason. And in many of the regions that they have wanted to recruit from the most, they've had to lower the bonuses just simply because they can't afford them. There's high inflation in Russia, indicative of Russia spending more money than they have. Russia's been able to sustain for quite a long time because they saved up quite a large war chest before they entered the war. That's now effectively exhausted. It's never really exhausted because you can always print more money, but in the sense of that war chest being able to prevent Russia from descending into more inflation, that's effectively exhausted. So their economy is going to be in shambles. Obviously, that's going to continue after the war ends, because what's causing their economy to be in shambles is not only the cost of the war, but also the sanctions and the damage to their international reputation. Those are not things that are going to get fixed overnight. In a best case scenario, it would probably take a decade for Russia to fix that. And so that's all a problem. But as a side effect of the economy being damaged, you have internal resentment growing in Russia, where obviously when you touch people's finances, that's the number one thing that everybody notices. People get upset. And so that's caused some instability in Russia, where they have been doing some more authoritarian type things internally to try to get ahead of that and retain control. So overall, the country gets more unstable every year the war goes on, and that's a risk that Vladimir Putin is playing.
And I'm detecting in your material and others a sort of a Vietnam style loss of trust in the government, that Russia can actually win and that these deaths will actually count for something in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing we see increasingly is from the war bloggers in Russia, they're getting more critical of their government, which is a big deal. Russia is not a free society like we are in the States. Some people will say we're not a free society to certain degrees, but in Russia, you're not legally allowed to criticize the government, and especially not the special military operation, as they call it. We all know it's a war. And you can go to prison for decades, literally, if you say a bad word about this. But we now see Russian war bloggers becoming more vocally critical of the war strategy, and that's a big move. And as all this internal criticism is ramping up, actually, this past week, we've seen Russia do a very drastic step to try to control that narrative, which is banning most of the popular communications apps, whether that be YouTube, WhatsApp, Discord, Telegram, so that everybody's forced, if they want to communicate amongst themselves, to go on the state-controlled Max app, where they can monitor literally everything that's being said and control the narrative that way. And so it is interesting to see people becoming more critical of the government when they can go to prison for that, and the Russian government trying to get ahead of that to control that. So obviously, it might be a bigger deal than we even realize in the West, in countries where we're not in Russia and seeing what's going on every day.
And it's tea leaves or crystal ball, but there is some wonder if this is a prelude to a new phase in the war, a broadening of conscription, like you've studied the wars, a Kaiserschlacht, one final big push to finally make a breakthrough in Ukraine. Is there any sign of that as far as you know?
It's hard to know, but what I'll comment on that is, Russia is not in a war where they can win simply by conscripting more men to attack Ukrainian positions. Potentially, the best they could do is get through the current Ukrainian fortifications, at which point they would come up on some very hardened positions where I honestly don't believe they could penetrate no matter how many men they had, because Ukraine is, I hate to say it this bluntly, but Ukraine has essentially set these places up as killing fields where it doesn't matter how many soldiers Russia sends, Ukraine can handle them. So it could be one final desperate push that Russia is preparing for, a Hail Mary. But, one thing that's marked this war that's been very fascinating is Vladimir Putin has been extremely hesitant to resort to conscription throughout the entire war, when arguably it would have benefited him. And so there's obviously something about that he fears. As I mentioned, he has relied primarily on essentially bribes, very high salaries for Russian soldiers to get people to come and join the military. Now that Russia is running low on money, it could be that they're going to be forced to go to conscription simply because of that, even though they don't want to. But that doesn't necessarily mean Russia is going to go to a huge, large-scale conscription. It might just mean they're moving towards conscription. And because Vladimir Putin has been afraid of what this could do internally, cause internal dissent, Russia might be trying to kind of control the communications apps because of that, so that people, can't organize against him when that move is made. So it's hard to say. I would say it's a possibility. It's a real possibility, but I don't think it's the only one or the most likely one when I look at what's going on.
And more men hasn't worked so far. How do you think this war will end? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, there's always theories, and my opinion changes as the war progresses, but I think the most likely end is somehow internally Vladimir Putin falls out of power. I don't think that the most likely way that would happen is from a revolt, but it could happen. It has happened in Russian history. But the most likely outcome would probably be some kind of a coup among Russian leadership, oligarchs who are sick of the war because it's destroying their wealth, and they kind of move against Putin. And you can actually see Putin kind of thinking of that as a real possibility when you look at how many oligarchs and high-level Russian leaders have fallen out of favor and fallen out of windows. And you can see that as a method for him to control against that outcome. But at the end of the day, you always have to replace these people with somebody. And at the end of the day, there are always other people in power that even if you're Vladimir Putin and you're a dictator, you need these men to help run your government. You can't just have nobody. And if these people see the war as detrimental to their own wealth and their own goals, it's not at all unreasonable that they would move against Putin. So I see that as the most likely outcome. Over time, Russia continues to have damage on their economy, damage on their military. It becomes clear that the war is unsustainable. It can't be won. And then there's a move against Putin internally.
Thank you, Paul. Paul Warburg. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dale.